coming. And
Hello.
we're excited to share our topics with you. So I think I'm going first. I think the original idea of this this panel was sort of social disease, like discrimination as a social disease. And so I think we're all going to be talking about particular types of discrimination or the root of particular types of discrimination. So I have slides, and I'm going to go ahead, I guess, and share my my slideshow with you. And I guess if it's okay with everyone, I'll just go ahead and start. And I'm going to be really careful to keep this to 10 minutes so that I can be mindful that I have other people and that there are 5 people on this panel. All right, so just give me a moment. There's something wrong with the sharing. Oh no, it's not. There's something. Can you see slides, or did I share? Okay, all right. So everyone can see my slides. Okay. So this is the title of my presentation. My name's Amanda Mulder. I'm a professor in the English department. I run the writing program too. And this is a topic of research that I'm really interested in. It's called linguicism, and I'll explain what that is in just a second. So essentially, here's one of my arguments. To understand English fully, you need to understand its full variety. What that means is that, okay, why is this not working? There we go. You need to have a healthy skepticism about the idea of one singular language called English, the idea that there's one correct way to speak English. Sorry, it keeps bringing me off of my slides. A more useful way to think about English is as a collection of vernacular languages. And we can also call these vernaculars Englishes. I know that kind of sounds like it's grammatically incorrect. Some of you have probably never heard Englishes before, but it's a grammatically productive word. It allows us to make a distinction that we couldn't make otherwise, and that's something that's really important about language. So vernacular, probably you've heard that word before. It means using the native language or dialect of a country or a district, or it could also mean spoken as a mother tongue by people of a particular country or district. However, vernacular language can also be written, and that's kind of where it gets interesting. So Shakespeare, for example, often stands in for proper English in our era, but in truth, he wrote in a variety of different vernacular languages from a variety of different groups of British people. Many writers leverage the creative power of vernacular languages, and he's just one person who did that. So vernacular Englishes are everywhere. This is language is an incredibly innovative entity. We've got them in many different countries, and English itself is currently spoken or written by over 400 million speakers as a mother tongue speakers as a first language, and at least an additional 500 million people who use English as a second or foreign language or an additional language. As English spread via British and American imperialism and colonialism, it's taken on a variety of different structures, sounds, meanings, and discourse norms in local contexts. And so English simultaneously stands in for a language of colonial domination, but it's also a language that has been taken and adapted and restructured by lots of different people all over the globe. All right, but we hold with us a variety of different myths about standard language and about vernacular language. We often believe that there's only one standard variety of a particular language, that variety is inherently superior to all other versions of a language, that it has no accent, and that it's fixed, that it doesn't change. And there are parallel myths about vernacular languages. So a lot of people believe that they're deformed versions of the standard, that they have no grammar or are structurally haphazard, that they're responsible for the decline of the standard variety, and that they're only spoken by less educated or lower class people. 2 scholars, their names are Dora Ahmad and Sean Del Nero. They argue that these myths are rooted in the English-speaking world in any way. They're rooted in the early modern period. So what they argue is that rulers used technologies such as printing presses and dictionaries, as well as schooling, to elevate one variety of English over others. Replication, one version of a text becomes, because it gets printed over and over again. And dictionaries allow one meaning or spelling to become the correct one. And then the British colonized groups of people indigenous to many different regions around the globe. They forced these groups to use English, forbade or punished the use of native languages, imposed their dominance over peoples and using English. And then, as happens naturally with language, varieties of English arose in colonies that were not exactly like what the imperial powers thought were the standards. So vernaculars arose, and people started using them. And even vernacular Englishes that predate the colonial context were labeled as wrong. Colonial schools labeled these vernaculars as wrong. And in both situations, schools become these places where vernacular languages are forbidden. Their use was punished. And so Shondell Nero and Dura Ahmad actually argue that schools become spaces for explaining language in terms of rules and exceptions. So so you have this one version of English that begins to dominate, and this vernacular was removed, ironically enough, as the language of ordinary people and encouraged as a prestige variety. And then all other versions get labeled as problematic, and that's a pretty arbitrary thing that happens. So these two scholars use this history to help us debunk some of these myths. So here's what they say about these myths. One, there's only one standard variety of a language. Actually, language is by nature multiple, changing, and always localized. Standard variety, like the quote unquote standard variety, isn't inherently superior to other varieties. Instead, these languages were deliberately selected to serve the interests of rulers, and their superiority is fabricated. The idea that standard language has no accent is also not true. Everything we say has an accent. The standard variety changes with region. And then the standard language is fixed, it doesn't change. That's also a myth. All language evolves. That's the nature of languages. And then these parallel myths, vernaculars are deformed versions of the standard language. Actually, no, all versions of a language are equal. They're all connected to one another. Myth 2, vernaculars have no grammar or they're structurally haphazard. All languages follow rules. Every single dialect in the world follows particular rules. There are things you can do and things you can't do in those languages. That's an organic part of languages. Vernaculars are responsible for the decline of the standard variety. This idea is wrong. All languages are vernaculars. Standard languages capture one single version and elevate it above others. And then vernaculars are only spoken by less educated or lower class people. This is called linguicism. All languages are vernacular, so but to make this, it's discrimination based on dialect. In reality, all people are speaking different vernaculars. So why does this matter, right? Why should we care about linguicism? What does it do to us? So here's a few examples. The effects of linguicism. One is linguistic profiling. A professor at Stanford named John Baugh coined this term, linguistic profiling. He labeled it a social disease. And what he did to understand linguistic profiling, he designed an experiment to understand how linguicism affects access to housing. He had a bunch of people involved in the experiment call about rental properties using various different accents and various different dialects. And the callers using varieties of English that are often considered less prestigious were more often told that housing was not available, but those using varieties with historical prestige were told that housing was available. And so the way somebody is speaking is affecting their access to good, decent housing. Here's another example. Two scholars named Rickford and King argue that linguicism affected the outcome in the trial of George Zimmerman, the man who shot and killed an unarmed 17-year-old boy named Trayvon Martin. In that trial, a woman who was the last person to speak to Martin before he was murdered. She was the prosecution's primary witness. Her name was Rachel Jeantel, and she speaks African-American and Caribbean-inflected English. Jurors ridiculed her as inarticulate, as not credible. The court reporters' transcripts of her testimony were inaccurate. People bullied her on social media. And so, in a sense, there was no fair trial because the prosecution's primary witness wasn't listened to. So why is this a social disease? Jurors had learned to stereotype people speaking Jeantel's variety or varieties of English as unintelligent. The court reporter was not familiar enough with her dialect to transcribe her testimony. They had not learned how to listen, how to be patient with language difference. Our social and educational systems had failed those who labeled her as unintelligent or incomprehensible. So ironically, even though they were labeling her as uneducated, it was really them that we could label as uneducated. There, beyond the sort of equal justice and equal access to housing, beyond these social justice issues, there are also professional implications for everyone. The way that a scholar named Suresh Kanagaraja explains that is this. He says, as industrial, business, and marketing agencies across the world communicate with each other, they are compelled to conduct transactions in a variety of different Englishes. At its most intense, the internet presents a forum where varieties of English mingle freely. There are online journals, discussion circles, websites that any in the world can go to for information, but without the willingness to negotiate Englishes, we get little from these resources. So we actually have a responsibility to ourselves to cultivate a sort of patience for linguistic difference. So how do we do that? How do we cultivate familiarity with and patience for language difference in ourselves? So here's how not to do it first. Learning a single set of rules will not make you a better speaker or writer of global Englishes. Neither will forbidding yourself to let your accent show, and neither will sticking to some idea of proper English in all speech and writing. This is because these approaches assume that like this one single standardized English is something that can be identified, penned down, memorized, and it won't change, and that other Englishes pollute that process. But here's what does work. Learning or learning about as many Englishes as you can, learning a new language other than English if you don't know one already, building your knowledge of the histories of different Englishes so that you can use and listen to a variety of Englishes with information and with good judgment, and then experimenting with your own Englishes and other languages. How can you make your language represent your most original thinking, culture, and values? And that's all I have. And I went a little bit over, so I apologize for that. Let me stop sharing. Okay. I think probably we should save questions until the end, right? Yeah. So, May, are you next?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to be the next one, and I'll start by showing my PowerPoint as well. I hope this process will be smooth. It seems like it's working. Can you see the document here? Good, thank you. I am a professor of Chinese from the Department of Languages and Cultures and Literature. And my topic today is on a martial arts film and the sick body. So this is included in the course I'm teaching this semester about the East Asian cinema, and this is like a one section because martial arts, we know that has been a very dominant so-called the Chinese film genre. So it's through teaching this course, I have discovered, myself as a scholar, something behind the popularity of this particular genre, and I find it very interesting. I want to share with everyone, and particularly we might think about the theme of innovation, what is contained in this film genre, especially we believe that film is an area that the filmmakers, they have to innovate, they have to break new grounds all the time, right? So we know that this martial arts film is defined as Chinese, but it also has this global reach. So these movies, those type of movies, they have been considered very fantastic and sometimes even identified as exotic. And then you can see its influences in many of the Hollywood movies, such as Jackie Chan's Rush Hour 2. As on the left side, you can see was America's #1 live action comedy film of 2001. And then here you see that's a still image from The Matrix. We know that that film has really noted for its special effect and choreography because of its incorporation of this fighting sequence that's derived from the martial arts genre. And then on the right side is the Chinese director Zhang Yimou, his hero, and which was also hugely popular because its description of this very beautiful fighting scene in a natural environment. So all those kind of confirms our understanding about the importance of our physical body. And then in contemporary culture, you can say that popularity of the martial arts film kind of shows this visibility of body on screen. Um, so basically, if you think more about this kind of martial arts films, right, you can say that all those martial arts films, they have heroes or heroines. They all need to somehow display their physical strength. So how exactly those characters, they show their physical strengths? So this is something I really want to tackle today. Maybe typically we will believe that in order to show their physical strengths, or sometimes we say their masculine strengths, right? It's better for them to show their the bare body, their masculine chest, their very strong arms, their very mighty legs. So you see that on screen. And on top of that, maybe we need to show them repeatedly use their strong arms to punch and use their mighty legs to kick. So that's how we have imageries created by the legendary Hong Kong American actor, director, and martial artist Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee was named as by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. So I'm just quoting that to show that he was a very influential figure of the time, and his movies was very popular during that time. That kind of typified people's understanding about a proper way of martial arts film, right? So you think about martial arts film, you are thinking about this a strong male body that is fighting, kicking. Um, so we have this understanding about martial arts film until, you can say, 2000, when Ang Lee made Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It's very influential as well. I'll say you just look at the number of awards it has won, and the number of awards has been nominated for was kind of unprecedented in terms of its success and also in terms of the box office achievement. So, but there's something very intriguing about this particular film, especially if we want to compare this typical male character, the warrior in this film, with those images created in Bruce Lee's martial arts films. So as you can see in this still image, I'm sharing that this main guy, Li Mubai, in the film, you can see that he is not really showing his very strong body at all. And he is situated in this very green bamboo forest. And throughout the film, you can see that he's really showing a different kind of masculinity or different kind of physical strengths. You can argue that it seems that the director Ang Lee is trying to tell us something different. Now, what exactly is that? So I'm trying to say that by showing this main character Li Mubai, his meditative tendencies, that Ang Lee's film connects with a traditional understanding of physical strength and a type of masculinity that is understood as literary learning, artistic pursuit, and moral cultivation, and good personal governance. You know, that's a very different the kind of than the modern and even I would say Western understanding about masculinity as sheer physical strengths. So also by showing that Li Mubai in the bamboo forest and being covered in a billowing long rope, right? His chest is not shown. We don't know how muscular he is. So it also reveals the relation between selfhood and body, understood in Confucian culture. There are two aspects to that. First is selfhood is not defined by biological traits, but determined by social roles and obligations. And second one is about the insignificance of the biological body. It is the marking of cultural patterns and the rituals that make a person. So Li Mubai, physically attractive, is not about, his the sex, the biological body as much. So it's very interesting if we look at Li Mubai here in the film Crouching Tiger and the Hidden Dragon, and this character, this actor Chow Yun-fat, he also played another film in Confucius, and he played the role of Confucius, and that's what I was trying to do. You can see, trying to uncover this kind of traditional understanding of masculinity that the director Ang Lee, he was trying to connect with, to present a different type of martial arts film. And you can say that that contributed to the success of the film. However, if we look through colonial history, we discovered the kind of correlation between an individual's personal body and the national status of his country. So there are a lot of studies about that. I'm not going to go into details. People are really trying to understand what caused what, basically. Whether it is the term on the left side, the right side, there's a book publication on this as well. On the left side, basically, you are seeing that Bruce Lee, he's holding this sign. On the sign, it says the segment of East Asia in the Chinese language. So that's from his movie Fist of Fury, 1972. On the right side is a book-length study about entitled The Discourses of Weakness in Modern China, the historical diagnosis of the segment of East Asia. So it still is a mystery. Whether it's a term that helped colonizers to kind of explain, also justify the subordinate status of a weak nation in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, such as China, or vice versa. It is because of the Qing government's the losses in war that because of that, those Chinese people in that country, they were given such a label. So, but regardless of what caused what, along with Chinese intellectuals in the early 20s calling for westernization and modernization in a popular culture terrain, we see the rise of the martial arts novels and the film. Through muscles on screen, one may argue that Chinese people have been trying to kind of dispel the accusation of their physical weakness. And ironically, as I was trying to argue in the earlier section of my talk, that in this Confucian culture, one's outer biological appearance of being effeminate does not reduce a man's masculinity at all, or it can be even an indicator of one's civil masculinity that is even more regarded than the martial type, which is the so-called more Western, the modern type. And then you can, here, one might think that this term of, the segment of East Asia has been hopefully been outdated, but still it's used still very recently by a very prestigious avenue in America. So I'm also trying to show that this film genre that is considered most Chinese actually shows the waning or the decline of traditional Chinese culture. So especially if we understand that the body, its insignificance in Confucian culture, or that body being held as insignificant as, compared with other cultural forces that's considered more important to defining someone's agenda or someone's identity. So if we see that kind of traditional understanding of body, because of its decline, if that's regarded as the last buttress of that culture, then the very visibility of body on screen shows the loss of that culture. So that maybe is the most ironic part about this phenomenon about the martial arts film, its popularity. So there is another film, one of the most recent ones by a very esteemed Taiwan director Hou Xiaoxian, The Assassin. It seems that he is trying to break a new ground for this type. And as you can see that he's portraying the body as this type of intermediary space between heaven and the earth. And he's trying to explore this kind of change from spiritual freedom to individual freedom. So you can say that this main character, the warrior Nie Yinyang in this film, she is trying to gain control over her body. And so she is trying to chart her own path and find some kind of independence. And through doing that, this director, Hou Xiaoxian, she is really trying to reclaim some of the, you can say, old traditional understanding about the position of the body in the cosmos, and then which probably is related to what I said earlier about this very highly innovative quality of the genre of the martial arts. I'm going to end my speech here, and then let's switch to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Assume that everyone can see my screen. Yes. So I am Dr. Di Martino. Like Dr. Yang, I come from the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Literatures, where my specialty is Italian studies. So the title of my talk today is Social Inequality, Epidemics, and the Immigrant Experience. We touch on some of these issues in the class on Italian American experience, but I will also develop these issues from a perspective that we don't necessarily devote a lot of time to, we don't have a lot of time to develop to in the class. I will use a cultural studies approach grounded in literature to explore the interconnection between social inequality and epidemics as pertains to the experience of those migrants who came to America from in the late 1800s and early 1900s from what at the time were considered to be as the racially suspect, so the not quite white parts of Europe, Southern and Eastern Europe. My focus will be the mass migrations of peasants, the ones you see represented in Louis Hines' photography, mostly from Southern Italy. These migrations followed the political unification of Italy in the late 1800s, and they were essentially also a result of the newborn countries, newborn nations' failure to address the feudal structure that after foreign colonization continued to oppress landless peasants in Italy, perpetuating social immobility. It was also due to the fact that a discourse developed at this time in Italy about the two races of Italy and how that discourse basically constructed Southern Italians as being socially, culturally, racially, and genetically primitive with respect to the northern counterparts in Italy and in Europe, which really is what helped promote the hegemony of urban and entrepreneurial northern elites with legislations and colonizing practices. We talk about internal colonization of northern Italy over southern Italy at this time that increased existing inequalities and led many, like Donna Gabaccia argues in this great book, to rebel with their feet, basically by leaving the country. My objective is to examine, on the one hand, how this prejudicial discourse that developed in post-unification Italy, it was amplified when migrants actually reached the American shores and resulted, among other things, in the construction of the image of the immigrant as pollutant. And on the other hand, what I'd like to do is to look at how minor literature, so literature that is told from the perspective of subaltern groups, what we define as minorities, has sought to promote social innovation by actually overturning those discourses and constructing a body imagery that exposes the connection between health disparities and structural inequality. So how narratives of privilege and oppression are actually imprinted on the flesh. So to start, when many migrants arrived to America in the 1800s and 1900s, just like today, they found racialized landscapes where class, race, gender, private property, the law, they pretty much determined the metabolic relationships that they established with the environments, with their environments. And so the bodies of migrants became part of capitalist ecologies that aimed at consolidating the power and augmenting the power of the dominant white Anglo-Saxon groups. And in these capitalist ecologies, basically, you had the transformation of not only nature, but also the transformation of the human body. So those two things went hand in hand. So you had the development of polluted landscapes, and at the same time, you have the development of bodyscapes of exposure and exploitations as a result of factors such as hazardous work, whether it be physically demanding, dangerous, or leading to toxic exposure, or unhealthy housing conditions. So whether it be a countryside with endemic illnesses, overcrowded tenement buildings without sufficient sanitary services, you see represented here, or housing in proximity to any industrial toxic sites. Again, these are all things that continue to happen nowadays. The emigrants' bulletins published by the Italian state at the time, it actually reported that just a few months after Italian shepherds, peasants, and fishermen moved to America, they became weak. Their bodies became weak, sickly, or they died as a result of things such as injuries and fatalities due to unsafe working conditions. And in the class, we actually read an excerpt from a very important novel. Pietro Di Donato was a bricklayer, and he wrote Christ in Concrete to talk about his experience as a second generation Italian American. And he describes really well, and in a way that it's very graphic, as my students have commented, the gruesome deaths of immigrant construction workers who, as he claims, are reduced into a meaty squash by the great God job. So we hear, America will eat you, spit your bones, the scaffolds are not safe, for the rich must ever profit more, the men are driven, and they prefer death or injury to loss of work and die. And then another important factor was contracting endemic diseases, such as malaria, for the Italians who came to do agricultural work. And in Mary Bucci's novel, historical novel, Sweet Hope, where the author once again documents a family history, and she's a third generation now. And she describes how Italians, like her family, who were imported to work on southern cotton plantations in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were actually oftentimes made to live in the unhealthiest part of the plantations. Many died, and many more would have died, according to Bush, if some of their African-American co-workers had not convinced, like we find in the novel, which again relates the author's family's history, if their African-American co-workers had not convinced their managers that people can make cotton if they're half dead. Contracting illnesses or diseases related to asbestos or toxic waste exposure. So in, again, another fictional autobiography that we read in the class, Umbertina, Ellen Barolini talks about how one of the main protagonists, Serafino, who worked building railroads in the late 1800s, when he went back home to find a wife, which is a practice that happened at the time. He brought things back to his village in Italy that they had never had there, the money in his pockets and the tuberculosis in his lungs. The protagonist also end up losing actually 2 children as a result of similar causes in America, one of them in the New York tenements. And then in another more recent novel, Suzanne Antonetta's Body Toxic, an environmental memoir, and I think the title is a tell-all. This is an ecofeminist work. The author's immigrant families from Italy and Barbados, they pursue their vision of the American dream by building a summer house, a summer escape in the boglands of New Jersey. But they're unaware that the reason why they could afford that, that space is that the area is being used as a landfill to dispose of hazardous waste. So one by one, mirroring the compromised landscape, the author and her family become sick. And so we read, our parents wanted to give their children the gift of open spaces, again, our immigrant parents. My father had seen his brother almost die of scarlet fever. He wanted us to be healthy. This is the story of my body. My thyroid cells became something other than thyroid cells. The ovaries are gone. My landscape poisoned me. Italy, a country many people left so that they could go to another place and eat radium. So you can essentially see how the literature helps us, right, to end environmental history is doing a lot to recollect these experiences and to show how poor health was essentially then, as it is now, a lot of times a byproduct of environmental and social conditions produced by a white capitalist economy that tends to treat migrants as expendable working hands. Yet the tendency, right, is to see the bodies of migrants as the primary vector of many of those very same diseases that they contract in America as a result of structural inequality. So I have some examples here of how in the early 1900s, various groups from Southern and Eastern Europe were being blamed for introducing certain diseases or producing certain epidemics. And one of them, I won't touch upon it, I could give many, many classes on this topic, but the crime epidemic also found at the time an important target in particularly Sicilian Americans. So a bodily discourse developed, a nativist bodily discourse developed that promoted the notion of the unwholesomeness of the unprivileged foreign body, right? The unprivileged foreign body. Its supposed predisposition to deviant behaviors, mental disability, as well as physical diseases. And these were all applications of social Darwinism that rationalized and justified things such as imperialism, racism, inequality, white supremacy. We will have another presentation dealing with this issue today. So it also instilled a fear of alien contagion. It went into policymaking in that it informed immigration practices and legislations at the time. And I will just talk about the example of the quota system that in the 20s limited entry of these genic groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you had a lot of political cartoons, which I always like to go and find that comment on these issues. So there was essentially a lot of social scapegoating. Migrant groups were deemed, migrant groups that were deemed as undesirable at the time were victimized to divert the attention away from the nation's failure to deliver its promise of a modern, developed, equitable, prosperous, and healthy living for all. And then you have the counter narratives, right? You have the narratives that really try to promote social innovation in that they're trying to develop an awareness of how it is actually discrimination and its production of inequality at the structural level, right? Whether it be through work or housing that generates health disparities. So, and I just want to call attention to the fact that there was a very lively political counter-discourse at this time, whereby immigrants from many different nationalities participated in early, in anti-capitalist labor movements in the early 1900s. A lot of them were also women. So I have an example from Anna Barbieri, who participated in the protest of female garment workers in New York. And she wrote, we have become human machines who stay locked in the immense industrial prisons where we lose our strength, our health, our youth, where our rights are shattered before the greed of the bourgeoisie. Okay, so important that, you know, the immigrants themselves were not just silent, you know, they had agency and they became involved, right, in the construction of this counter discourse. And then you have the poetic counter narratives that I have shown you some examples of earlier, where literary storytelling is actually being used as a way of turning physical disorder into civic possibilities in various ways, among them, by making visible and generating awareness of how human diseases and bodily transformations, just like environmental degradation, are effects of capitalist ecologies of exploitation, contamination, inequality. And here, literary criticism, eco-criticism and ecofeminism are doing a lot of work. Again, Antonetta's memoir, Body Toxic, is an example of how literature is attempting to show the connection between body and the environment and how capitalist ecologies affect also health disparities. By rekindling memories of oppression that can help us understand the connection between inequality and disease that continues to exist in the present. And alternative histories from below are doing a great job at doing this. So whether it be Di Donato talking about his experience as a bricklayer, or many years later, Bucci talking about her family's experience working on the plantations in the South, that connection is being made very evident. And that connects with something that we need to be very aware of also in the present, because you only have to go on the website of the CDC to read that COVID is impacting particularly racial and ethnic minority groups. And why is that? By interrogating also the link between white privilege and health, the body of Italians changed over time as they were admitted into Anglo-Saxon America, into the social narratives of white privilege. So a lot of Italian-American writers are actually really obsessed by investigating this issue, focusing on the invention and the production of white privilege. And then another example, and again, this list is not exhaustive, but my last example, and then I will also give you, read a piece of a poem with you, is the attempt to recollect past moments of resistance, also as a way of stimulating the development of transnational forms of labor and environmental activism in the present. And here you have, again, transnational working class studies that are interpreting and they're inspiring authors in this way. And Paola Corso's poem Girl Talk is an example of this. The poem is a dialogue, an imaginative dialogue between the immigrant women who died, unable to escape the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the fire of 1911 in New York, and the Chinese, Indonesian, Vietnamese, Taiwanese girls making Nikes today. So it describes an ongoing experience of exploitation and contamination, but it also invites to develop transnational alliances similar to those of women workers of the past. Again, awareness that transforms itself into an ethical and a political consciousness. The poem builds through a refrain of gluing one's work conditions to a part of the shoe, and ends with the following call to resistance, which is the end of my talk as well. And the Triangle girls say to the Chinese girls, the Indonesian girls, the Vietnamese, the Taiwanese girls, girls, take the chopsticks you can't hold at lunch because your fingers are too numb and glue them to the Velcro of the shoe. Take the vertigo, the headache, the vomiting, the memory loss, shortness of breath, the cancer, and glue it to the glue of the shoe. Take the glue, toxic glue, and put it under his nose, a Nike nose, and anything goes nose, and make him sniff. So I am done. I stopped sharing, and it's time for Dr. Monge now.
All right, everyone hear me okay? See this okay? All right, so my talk, I decided to go in with the how Christianity played a key role and can continue to play key roles as both oppressor or liberator, or another way of putting it, as both the cause of or a major contributor to social disease or the antidote, depending on the way it manifests. And so I also work in, besides doing Christian thought and history, I work in one of my primary areas is philosophy of religion. And so political theorists like Karl Marx definitely have a strong place in what I'm going to present here. For those of you that aren't aware, Marx isn't just some thinker, but did intense cross-cultural, anthropological, and sociological research across cultures during his time period and across cultures before his life. And a number of historians since then, two of whom I'm drawing off of heavily today, Chris Harman and Howard Zinn, who wrote People's History of the United States and People's History of the World, along with David Chittister's Christianity, A Global History. I'll put these in the chat when I'm done, so if people want to do further reading or looking at this kind of thing. Anyhow, all the major types of discrimination have, racism, sexism, xenophobia, the hatred of the foreigner. What Marx and many historians following him find is that these are inherent functions of empire. That when a culture becomes imperial, looking to continually and rather infinitely expand its power and influence, it ends up being founded on and perpetuating power imbalances, where small groups of people benefit disproportionately from the surplus derived from the labor of the majority of people. Well, if it's the majority of people, well, then eventually they're going to rise up and demand better rights, right? Well, maybe, but eventually if they do, then you need other groups to exploit in order to keep your standard of living operative. So these groups, like I said, other groups will rebel and demand greater equality, threaten to even overthrow the society itself. And then you find new groups to otherize or make into the oppressed class. So like in the Roman Empire, and this goes back to the linguicism we heard about earlier. And so you have the category of the barbarian, right? These people outside the empire that you could pretty much do as you want to them, take their areas, exploit them. And it was a mockery of their language. Like the barbarian came from this kind of like sense that they're babbling. They don't speak proper language, right? But anyhow, the ways in which exploitation is perpetuated, things like genetic kinship and religion are used to keep masses of people of a shared imagined background, believing they have more in common with their oppressors than with their fellow oppressed people. And you can see this sort of thing going on all over the political landscape, especially in Europe and North America right now. But nevertheless, this is a social disease. But what these studies have shown across time is whether it be the Roman Empire, some of the major Chinese empires, major Muslim empires, et cetera, the Incan and Mayan empires, these patterns happen again and again, and it's an unsustainable model. Either society must shift to increasingly egalitarian and non-imperial goals and practices, to sustainable and egalitarian practices, or it will collapse on itself. It will collapse on itself. It's an autoimmune disease. And the more it tries to protect itself, the more it destroys itself. So let's look at how Christianity functions into this. So I'm going to kind of just go over this quickly, but Christianity for the first 300 years was not a religion of empire. It was actually a religion of a sort of pacifist resistance. It emerged from the underclass, and it brought in people from every religion. It promoted much greater gender equality than was normative in the society at the time. And it's seen as a threat by the powers that be. So it was persecuted quite regularly and intermittently, but regularly and harshly. It started to make roads into the middle class, and eventually, once you have middle class people, the Christians are, it becomes harder and harder to oppress them. Eventually, you have Constantine in 313. This is a fateful date. Issues the Edict of Milan and makes Christianity legal or tolerated. But then you get in the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius issuing an Edict of Thessalonica, and this is just 70 years later, now making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And in this move, you get the idea that all non-Catholics are now foolish madmen, and subject to, quote, the punishment of our authority, which in accordance with the will of heaven we shall decide to inflict. And so you now, for the first time, 350 years after Christianity begins, you have it as an imperial religion being used to decide in groups and out groups, who is free from like the state repression and who can be stripped of rights and exploited. So I want to look now at how it functioned within Europe in the initial, as a weapon of oppression, and then how it functioned in the legacy of colonialism. So let's start with in the kingdoms of Europe. Initially, most persecution is aimed at groups called heretics, divergent Christian groups that don't agree. But if we look through and pay more attention to why different groups were declared heretics, it's not just because of their theology. It often is because their theology differed because they spoke a different language or a different dialect, which was, in communicating itself, was seen as suspect. And this pattern happens again and again and again throughout the first millennium of Christianity. Almost every major split and then persecution circles around ethnic groups and linguistic groups just as much as it does around ideas. But by the middle of the 6th century, the only religion tolerating the Roman Empire besides Christianity is Judaism. But then eventually, and that's tolerated barely, but by the Middle Ages, scholastic theology made these key declarations. One, that Christianity is the rational religion. But also, following Aristotle, that the human being is the rational animal. The thing that makes humans different than animals is that they're rational. So some scholastic theologians, a number of them, including St. Albert the Great, who was Thomas Aquinas's mentor, said that non-Christians, especially Jews, take on the category of the irrational animal or of subhumanity. Right? If the rational animal is what the human is, and Christianity is the only rational thing to believe, then especially Jewish people who should know better, this is the thinking of medieval scholastic theologians, are demonstrating a subhumanity, a sub-rationality. And this led to an intellectual question in Europe that raged for centuries called the Jewish question. What do we do about these other people that don't fit in, that don't submit to our rationality and our way of life? And then they get blamed for the economy and all these other sorts of things. And this Jewish question, this, in a direct line, centuries go on, and you have the Nazi extermination program in the 1940s, which was called there's the blanks, final solution to the Jewish question. Medieval scholastic theology laid seeds for this kind of horror centuries later. And this is just touching one area within Europe. I mean, women treated as witches, other different groups marginalized, the list goes on and on. But let's look quickly at colonialism and conquest. European powers, they realize, oh, well, we have a certain kinship. Their families are all intermarried. They don't want to war with each other unless they have to. And they start realizing, oh my gosh, there's all this other land to go and exploit. Okay, so several of these nations, Spain, Portugal, England, Netherlands, France, and so on and so forth, begin to seek new resources in land and labor. So this dehumanizing Christian theology we're just talking about was employed to legitimize the seizure of land from inferior peoples. Catholic and Protestant colonists use distinctly different types of theology, though, to suit their needs, because they have. So the interesting thing is, they both use Christianity to do it, the Catholics and the Protestants, but they have to do it in different ways because they don't have the same theological background. So the Spanish Catholic colonists would show up and read this document that was created by Spanish theologians and signed off by the Vatican and so forth, called the Requirement. They'd read it to the indigenous peoples that they discovered or encountered, is probably better there. They thought they discovered them. This text informed the people that God had given the world to the Pope. The world, you show up, hey, you know what? The world actually belongs to the Pope. We're letting you know. And now you have the chance to rationally submit to this, be enlightened to this, or show yourself to be subhuman by resisting it and be destroyed. All the men murdered. I mean, literally, the document would say, "We will kill all of you males and enslave your women and children, as God would have it." Right? The English Protestants, of course, don't have a pope, so they can't refer to that authority. But instead, what they do, and this one actually arguably has a longer lasting effect. They argue that in Genesis 1:26, when God says to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and to till the land and subdue it, that means that real humans do settled agriculture. They do the big fields and farms and demarcations and so forth, and then harvest it and sell it to other people and all that kind of stuff that Europeans were doing by this point. That's what it meant to be in the image and likeness of God. And if you weren't doing that, you weren't fulfilling the image and likeness of God. And not only then did the Europeans have the right to take it, but they should do it to actually fulfill the command of Genesis. And why I said this idea is a little bit even more nasty is that you see it still today. You don't see God invoked as much, but it's like, well, this land isn't being used properly. This pipeline needs to go in. These backwards people, you see it in America with the Dakota pipeline and other things. You see it in Canada. Trudeau is not doing much better with the Keystone stuff up there. And you can see it in southern Mexico right now, even though they have a supposedly progressive president, as he harasses the Mayans in Chiapas. Okay? And always with this, we know how to use the land, you don't mentality. But anyhow, this is ironic because the message of Jesus, the gospel of the kingdom of God, is supposed to be, the kingdom of God is opposed to imperial kingdoms. It's not, first and foremost, it's not just a message about where you're going to go in the afterlife, and it's not about morphing into the kingdom of man, and I use that patriarchal term. Empires are almost always inherently patriarchal. Okay, but the kingdom of God stands in opposition to all of these ideas. Right? This third thing I have here. 5 core characteristics emerge from the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus's key teachings on what the kingdom of God looks like, the way of life he's bringing. It's ethical reciprocity. Treat others like you want to be treated. That doesn't go with imperial exploitation. Cancellation of debts. Debt is one of the main ways to exploit people. If you don't understand that yet, you will after you graduate with a bunch of student loan debt. Radical love of even your enemies. And finally, forgiveness and humility. And all of these explode these kinds of exploitative otherings that we've been talking about. And finally, St. Paul in Galatians 3:28 says, there's no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. You are all one in Christ Jesus. And many theologians have pointed out, this is supposed to explode racism, classism, and sexism. And yet somehow, once Christianity gets merged with empire, these things all got lost. They don't have to be lost forever, and it's not just theoretical. And I offer these 3 figures, all who drew heavily off of the message of Jesus to produce a much different world, to innovate solutions. Martin Luther King, of course, of the civil rights movement, giving his life in the United States. Dorothy Day, she's up for sainthood in the Catholic Church, potentially. And she was beaten regularly, among other things, by the police to fight for women's rights to vote. And over here we have Maria Skoptsova, an Eastern Orthodox saint who died in the Ravensbrück concentration camp after giving her life to save Jewish children in Nazi-occupied France. So Christianity doesn't have to be just the horrific religion of empire. It can be liberatory. And I'm done, so Dr. Bird can finish this out for us.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Bird from the Department of Biology. Thanks for hanging in there with us. I want to take a similar tack to, excuse me, the previous speaker. Talk a little bit about how science has contributed to oppression and how hopefully you can find answers that will help to end that oppression. And specifically, I want to talk about the relationship between science and racism. Frederick Douglass was born a slave in Maryland and then escaped and became a world-renowned abolitionist and activist for the rights of African Americans and women. And he said, pride and selfishness combined with mental power never want for a theory to justify them. And when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for this oppression. And as a scientist, it pains me to acknowledge that science has been used as justification for the oppression of people, and in particular, African Americans. The relationship between science and race goes back to the 18th century, when early biologists were busy classifying life forms. Plants and animals were being classified by people like Linnaeus, who also classified the human species into at least 5 different groups. He didn't use the term race, but biologists who followed afterwards soon did. People like Samuel Morton, who was a physician and scientist in the United States, accepted these divisions of what they now refer to as race, and more importantly, put them in a hierarchy, obviously with the white race being intellectually superior, morally superior, and the other races below, and in particular, people of African descent being at the bottom in terms of being intellectually inferior and morally inferior. And they set about proving what was to them to be obvious by looking for scientific data that would confirm what they had already accepted. Samuel Morton and others focused on the size of the brain and measured the cranial capacity of the different so-called races and showed that, at least in their data, that the white race, the cranium of the white race, did actually have a larger brain capacity, and this, in their view, justified the idea that the white race was intellectually superior. They also believed that God had created, many of them believed that God had created these separate races on separate continents, and that the fact that white people were intellectually superior justified the idea. Morton's data was used to justify the idea of slavery within the United States. Charles Darwin, arguably, well, I would say not arguably, the most important biologist of all, argued that there was a single origin of all humans, and he was adamantly opposed to slavery. But he was a product of his time. England, Victorian England in the 19th century was at the pinnacle of its imperialist power. And many white male scientists looked around at other civilizations and saw them as being inferior. This led to an obvious conclusion, at least in their mind, that human evolution was progressive, and Darwin accepted a racial hierarchy with white people being the most advanced. And he says this in a book that was published after The Origin of Species. Darwin wrote a book, The Descent of Man, that focused on the evolution of species. And he said that in that book, the belief that there exists in man some close relation between the size of the brain and the development of intellectual faculties is supported by the comparison of the skulls of savage and civilized races, of ancient and modern people, and by analogy, the whole vertebrate species. So this view was very pervasive through all scientists that were his contemporaries, including a second cousin of his. Francis Galton was inspired by his cousin's work. To him, it was obvious that intelligence ran through families and was therefore an inherited trait. And he set about finding data to support what he accepted as being true. And this led to a form of social Darwinism, which you've heard about, that was coined eugenics. Francis Galton coined this term to mean well-bred or well-born. The concern at the time was that the superiority of the white race was being threatened by intermarriage between people of lesser races and of feeble-minded people. They used flawed interpretations of their scientific investigations to justify these beliefs, and their work influenced many countries around the world, including the United States. Eugenic laws were allowed to force sterilization on people that were judged to be feeble-minded. Laws were brought in that were discriminatory, prevented intermarriage. And of course, we all know what happened in Nazi Germany. Social Darwinism led to an escalation from sterilizations to euthanasia, and finally the Holocaust that we just heard about. 6 million Jews were exterminated during the Second World War, and large numbers of other ethnic groups, including Roma, were exterminated because they were thought to be or accepted to be genetically inferior. And this persistence of these ideas that were supported by what I would call pseudoscience extended up into the 20th century, into the 1970s. A horrific medical study, the Tuskegee syphilis study, allowed several Black men to go untreated, though they had syphilis. They were never told they had syphilis. They were not treated with penicillin, which was determined to be an effective cure for this. And the justification that the scientists used is that African-American people were intellectually inferior, morally inferior, and therefore this represented a population that would be suitable for a study that would show scientists how syphilis progressed in people if it were untreated. Unfortunately, these men went on, many of them became blind, developed heart problems, brain ailments, and obviously many of them died. The study only ended in 1972 because of a whistleblower that spoke out and stopped this study. And sadly, many of the ideas that can be traced back to early scientists, early biologists, have been perpetuated and persist. And we see this in the United States today, spotlighted by the killing of George Floyd about 5 months ago. We still see evidence of racism, institutional racism that persists to this day, and expressed in many ways, including police violence against African Americans. Much of this, again, can be traced back to what science has said about the abilities of various races. I want to switch gears, and I have to admit, it's kind of depressing as a scientist to emphasize the role of science in perpetuating the myth of race. Modern science, modern biology has been able to contribute to the idea of, or investigate the idea, the concept of race. The human genome was published 20 years ago. And what we've learned in this study is that we're actually a very new species. As a species, we've only been around for 200,000 years or less. Not enough time to acquire much diversity in our population. In fact, we have much lower diversity relative to most other species, including chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are much more diverse than humans, but we don't refer to chimpanzees as subspecies or races. And so really there's no genetic basis for humans to accept racial divisions. There is a small fraction of genetic diversity that is thought to be adaptive, but this is more geographical in origin than anything else. There is no race gene. We've learned that. There are some genetic markers that correlate with as I said, geographic origins. Much of this relates to the fact that humans, we know, evolved in Africa, as I said, about 200,000 years ago. For the first half of this time, they occupied Africa, and much of the genetic diversity that's in the human population now is acquired at that time. Less than 100,000 years ago, a small subset of the African population migrated out into Europe, into Asia, into Southeast Asia, and across into the Americas. These people took a small subset of genetic variation from East Africa. And so it's become well known that the genetic diversity within populations that is spread around the world is generally greater than the genetic diversity between populations that are far-flung across the world. And this graph up here at the top, I think depicts that, where these circles depict the totality of genetic variation in African people, Europeans, and Asians. And as you can see, the European and Asian genetic diversity really overlap with one another. And again, that goes back to the fact that that genetic diversity is very small, resulting from the fact that a small group of people migrated out of Africa. Most of the genetic diversity is still found in Africa, includes much diversity that is not represented in Europeans and Asians. And again, this is because most of the genetic diversity that arose during the evolution of humans in Africa stayed in Africa. But again, I want to emphasize the point that what we've learned is that there is no scientific basis for the concept of race. The genetic diversity that we see within populations is greater than what we see between populations. And so, although, as I said, it's painful to acknowledge that science has contributed to the idea of race, racial divisions, hopefully modern science has shown people that there is no scientific basis for the concept of race. And I will end there, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Questions, anyone?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Alexander. I recognize your voice.
This is more of a broader scale question for the group of how do you think exercises like these will impact future generations, or the effectiveness of exercises like these in changing the thinkings of people who might have thought otherwise before?
Personally, I believe that education is key. So, and learning to see things differently, learning to look at things from different perspectives is important, and I believe in it, which is why I'm an educator. And then I'm going to have my colleagues comment on this as well.
Likewise, I like to throw back the words of Ben Shapiro, who is very resistant to a lot of these things in his face, which is facts don't care about your feelings. Meaning, I think two of the most important things that one can study is real science and real history. They're not gonna tell you what you need to believe at the end, but they will just cut into misconceptions. And while it's painful, people wrestle with it and either have to dig in further and retreat into ignorance, or they have to accept and change. But I think, when you ask about the usefulness of things like this, I often, start off my classes, or at some point in my classes, bring up that the brain has a fight or flight response to information that challenges core beliefs, just like to physical threats. And so it's good to just practice not reacting and sitting with new ideas that have shake things up. But yeah, it's difficult to know exactly what are the best ways to go.
I can speak from some personal experience. I think most of my students, at least from this semester, and some of you are in the room, so you can contest this if you want to, but most of them had never heard of linguicism. I mean, they knew this thing existed, right? Like they knew that this happened, the kind of thing that happened to Rachel Gentle happened, but they didn't have language to put to it. I'll own that, I didn't also know about linguicism, and also I have spent time in my life making fun of people who spoke differently from me, right? Like that's not something that those are things that I've committed, but I hope that learning about that has made people think twice. It certainly has me.
I'm going to, speaking to that, I think the College of Arts and Science recently, I think it's last year, shared a book entitled Evil of Banality on the life and death importance of thinking. Maybe this is related to what Professor DiMartino pointed out later, the importance of education. I think one of the key points that really impacted me when I was reading that was her idea about feeling and reasoning and awareness. So we kind of assume that our feeling, our emotional reaction to the outside world is something more innate to us. But her argument that our awareness actually contribute tremendously to our emotions. So what do we like, or what do we hate? What do we don't like, right? Those are determined or largely influenced by our awareness of issues. So that's also something from my film class or my talk about how you can enjoy certain type of movies, and then sometimes maybe that kind of joy can be taken apart because of your awareness, right? Or how we can consume some kind of a strong body on screen, but when you know more, you are forced to think more about that. I think there is definitely value to that.
I don't really have anything to add. I think you guys dealt with that very well. Hopefully we've got some other questions out there that we can add.
Thank you so much for sharing your feelings on this.
Other questions or thoughts you want to share with everyone? It doesn't have to be a well-formulated question, or your feedback, or anything maybe you find interesting or relevant, right? Or some of the takeaways, I think we would appreciate that as well.
And also clarifications about our disciplines as a whole. I mean, we're talking about biology and history, Catholicism and literature and film. Enrico was talking about the importance of knowing history. Sometimes you have to go to literature and to the movies in order to understand history, to look at it from new perspectives, right?
Amen.
So if you have questions about what we do, our disciplines, those would also clarifications.
I want to point out that Dr. DiMartino is offering to kind of help you guys with the assignment that you have to turn in based on this. So take her up on it, right?
I just wanted to say that it was really interesting to hear all your guys' different disciplines. It's crazy how so many different subjects can all tackle the same problem differently. But I just wanted to say thank you. But it was really informational and I enjoyed it.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback.
I have a really quick question for Dr. Yang. In my notes on your slides, I was just having a little bit of trouble like connecting what you talked about to social discrimination. Could you like really briefly kind of like summarize how your discipline, like the topics you touched on, connects back to the overall like overarching theme?
About discrimination. So maybe you can kind of understand that the body on screen that is really coalesced in this genre of martial arts. That kind of screen image is almost like a reaction to this derogatory term of the segment of East Asia. Yeah, so I think that summarizes the connection with the general theme of our talk. So we tend to think that the martial arts is just a film type for entertainment. There's nothing serious behind, but actually, if you understand it that way, both as a reaction against some kind of accusation of the the men, the Chinese men or women as well, Chinese people as being sick, right? That kind of accusation that kind of come from the outside. And because of that, because of the how to really want to dispel that kind of accusation, you can think about maybe this also related to other speakers talk about whatever the confirmation bias, right? So in order to, on one side, you have the oppressor who is really trying to justify their oppression by using all kind of mechanism. On the other side, you are seeing the oppressed. They are also using different ways to react to that. So you can say that the martial arts film is a type of reaction. And then in order to react that, they also have to give up their own culture, their own understanding about what is considered physically valid, or what is considered physically attractive, or what is considered masculine. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that really helps. Thanks so much.
I don't have a question, but just in general, I think every single one of you had such, like, it was super enlightening and it was very interesting, but I really was shocked by the science that played a role in the justification for racism. I did not really think about that before, so I think it's something that has really opened my mind up to kind of seeing the cause of why so many things are going on now and from years and years ago. So thank you for all of it.
Well, thanks for your comment. You know, for me too, being a scientist, going back and reading about the contributions that early scientists made for that, it's shocking. And as I said, somewhat painful. Scientists like to believe that science is an objective search for the truth. But we've seen at various times in history, it's been anything but. So thank you for your comment.
I think there's another question.
I just wanted to as well comment in addition to that, how wonderful I think it is to see all these different perspectives and how all the different fields and they're each way contribute and have contributed to the outcome of the world today, not only in their positive senses in which we have studied throughout history, sometimes in a more biased sense, but also in the negative contributions so we can learn not to repeat these through each discipline. And we can carry on through the future in a more positive manner.
I think those are great concluding words. I think the time is up, so we have to say goodbye, but we all have email accounts if you'd like to. If you have questions that you haven't asked today, feel free to do so. Would anyone else say anything? Harry, May, Amanda?
I think that you did a great job.
You did.
Yeah. You all did.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.